Hello and welcome to Voice of the Voiceless, Speak Your Truth. So today I'm going to be talking to a guest, Yvette, who is the creator of Southern Natural Parenting Network on Facebook. And she is very passionate about birth, breastfeeding and co-sleeping and baby-led weaning, baby wearing, anything basically to do with babies and parenting. So today we're going to be talking about co-sleeping. I have experience of co-sleeping myself, but in terms of the history of co-sleeping and the science of co-sleeping, I really am at loss. So I'm hoping that Yvette can help educate us today and just fill in some of the blanks, and hopefully we can delve into a good conversation. So Yvette, what can you tell us about the history of co-sleeping?
Okay, so firstly I just want to get the terminology right, because
Yes, sure.
there can be so much confusion. So co-sleeping is an umbrella term that embraces two ways of sleeping around babies.
Yep.
Room sharing, where the baby has their own separate sleep space within the room the parents are sleeping in, or bed sharing, where they share the same sleep surface as primarily the mother, but often both parents. And those terms are often used interchangeably and sometimes incorrectly.
Yep.
So even within people that are speaking an official way about co-sleeping can often not distinguish that they are referring to bed sharing by using the term co-sleeping. So co-sleeping in the form of room sharing is actually recommended by SIDS authorities now for the first 6 to 12 months, but they will say that they don't necessarily support co-sleeping. In that terminology they mean bed sharing. So it's all very confusing. If you go back to the 1960s, when I was born, it was not unusual for families to live in quite small accommodation. Children didn't grow up expecting to have their own bedroom, for example. It was normal for children to share bedrooms with multiple siblings, and babies would often sleep in their parents' bedroom simply as a space issue and no other reason. Mothers would bring babies into bed with them to feed them or to settle them during the night, and it was officially frowned upon, but there was no real reason given for recommending against it. If you go back further in I guess recent history, if you go back to around World War II and before that time, there were often very cramped conditions for families. You might have had families sharing a room with all their children, and often many children sharing a bed together. And by many I mean you could have half a dozen children sharing a bed together, or you might have several small children sharing a bed with their parents. If we look at some of the conditions that led to concerns around this, we're often talking about, say in the UK, where there was a lot of coalfield fires, so the air condition wasn't optimal, the bedding wasn't necessarily well cared for, laundered regularly. It's very hard to dry things if it's all smoggy and sooty outside. So the conditions that a lot of families were living in was certainly what we would consider to be very undesirable by today's standards. And there were a lot of concerns around mortality of babies. You did not expect to raise all your children 100 years ago, 200 years ago. There were situations where babies would be smothered in their sleep by a parental body or a sibling body or bedding. In some instances that was an intentional act by a mother who had no other way to manage the size of her family. So overlying was a great concern back in times like that. If we go back further before the industrial age, it was normal and natural for mothers to have their baby by their side, just as it was the way for babies to be breastfed. There weren't alternatives. Babies were breastfed, babies slept alongside their mothers. This is still the way in the majority of communities around the world. So it's the minority within the Western world that have separated mothers and babies and raised concerns about what we call co-sleeping. So a lot of those concerns have come around research into sudden infant death syndrome, which used to be referred to as cot death until as recently as the 1980s. It was still called cot death when I had my first child. And research into that, particularly in the 1990s, developed the Back to Sleep program, where parents were encouraged to lay their babies on their back to sleep, to not permit tummy sleeping. And what that did was halve the risk of SIDS, which is pretty significant. When I had my first child in 1984, 1 in 500 babies died of SIDS. It's now less by half. So I think it's 1 in 1,000 and dropping.
Yep.
So this is a fantastic thing we've done. We've changed a parental behaviour that has reduced infant mortality. The downside of that is the one area of SIDS incidence that's growing is deaths on armchairs and sofas, because mothers have become too scared to lie down to feed their babies. So they're sitting up in dangerous circumstances, doing their best in an armchair or a couch. They fall asleep, the baby's body slips and can become trapped. So we've actually created a new problem while we were fixing a previous problem.
Yep.
So there's obviously been a lot of attention paid to how and where babies sleep in the past 20 or 30 years. And out of that has come a lot of recommendations. But the science of infant sleep is still very, very young, and there's still a lot that we don't know.
Do you want me to? In terms of the science, you've mentioned a few figures there, but you said that science is still very young. Is there any science out there about bed sharing, room sharing, just in general? I've heard that mothers being in the same room as a child while they're sleeping decreases the chance of SIDS occurring.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yep. So there's a new terminology that's been introduced, which is sudden unexpected death in infancy, which is SUDI, S-U-D-I.
Okay.
And that includes SIDS, which is an unexpected death for which we do not know the cause. Then the other area of concern is accidental death, which includes smothering in various forms. A lot of research has been done by Dr. Helen Ball in the UK at Durham University, and also by Dr. James McKenna, who's in, I think it's Canada or North America. And a lot of what they're looking at is from a historical, anthropological perspective, particularly for Dr. McKenna. And Dr. Helen Ball's done a lot of work with observation of mothers and babies during sleep, and natural behaviours that are in place that protect babies. So we do have a lot of science now, and it's growing. A lot of studies have been ongoing, so the results continue to come out. It's still very recent that the recommendations changed to having the baby in the room for the first 6 to 12 months, as this is now known to reduce the risk of SIDS. We know that breastfeeding has a significant impact on SIDS rates. Any breast milk, so the baby doesn't need to be fully breastfed, but any breast milk for any period of time gradually reduces the risk. So there's some new figures that have just come out this year regarding that. You can get as much as a 40% reduction in SIDS by some breastfeeding. So that's quite significant. So we know that by breastfeeding your baby, by having them in the same room as you, by being a smoke-free household before the birth and after the birth, these things are very, very significant in SIDS reduction. We know that mothers who are breastfeeding their babies behave in a very predictable manner when they're sleeping on the same surface as their babies.
Okay.
They tend to adopt a very predictable position, and in their sleep they take action to protect the baby. They've been observed to push their partner away if he gets too close to the baby while they're all asleep. They will constantly check the baby and adjust their position or the baby's position as needed. So although we are asleep, we are not disconnected from what's going on. And there's very, very good science showing all of this. And there's a lot more that we can learn as we go on.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. It sounds like with the mother's natural instincts, just protecting the baby in their sleep. I find that really interesting. Is there any sort of idea as to, how that happens, or, what's happening within the mother's body?
Dr. James McKenna had an idea about 3 or 4 years ago, and he decided that there's no such thing as breastfeeding, and there's no such thing as infant sleep. There is just breast sleeping. And we certainly see that breastfeeding and infant sleep are entwined together. There are hormones that are released into the breast milk which have a sedating effect on the baby, and hormones released into the mother's body that have a sedating effect on the mother. So that drowsy, sleepy feeling that most of us experience when we're feeding a baby is part of nature's plan. There's evidence that mothers who formula feed may be woken less frequently during the night, but their overall amount of sleep is lesser. And that's because they take longer to fall back to sleep. So a breastfeeding mother may not wake up fully to feed her baby. There's been some interesting work with using an actigraph, which is basically like wearing a Fitbit, which measures your sleep. And the mother's reporting of how many times they've woken up at night to feed the baby compared to the actual measurement is quite incorrect.
Wow.
So they either over or underestimate how much sleep they've had. The ideal, as far as nature's concerned, is that the mother maximises her sleep and maximises the opportunity to feed the baby. So it makes sense that we just lie there with the breast and the baby connected, with the mother sleeping and the baby pretty well asleep as well. So one thing that they've observed is that by sleeping within arm's reach, mothers and babies' sleep cycles go into the same pattern. So when the baby comes into a light sleep stage, the mother also comes into a light sleep stage. So that's why we're very easily woken from a baby who needs a feed, because we're not in a deep sleep state. If you compare that to the baby being in a separate